Policy analysis is key to making sure that a certain policy can go through the policy cycle and reduce policy failure. There is a series of techniques that can be used to really look into the policy definition phase. So what is the policy issue that we are trying to solve? How to best find the solution that will be the most appropriate, how to define who the audience is. So who are the stakeholders and beneficiaries, how to consult them and bring in their perspectives and their ideas for this particular policy problem that we're trying to solve, and so on. But before we get into the policy analysis tools, let's just for a minute think about who the policy analyst is. I think all of us that do work in policy making or advocacy have engaged in, at some point, in one way or another, in policy analysis. Whether you are a political advisor to a minister, or you work as a director in the civil service somewhere, you are an NGO leader working in a think tank, you're an activist, or you're the minister herself. You've engaged in policy analysis. So the policy analyst in both literature and practice is seen as playing these three different roles. Or to better express this, there are three types of policy analysts. The first type is the researcher or the bureaucrat. This type of analyst is very good at finding the evidence for a certain policy or designing a research project, conducting the research project, looking at the data, analyzing it, and pulling it all together in a really big report that has looked at every angle of a certain policy issue that they're trying to address. But this type of policy analyst lacks the skills to present this data in a way that is perhaps useful to the policy-making process. They would usually lack the skills to do public speaking or the coalition building that is necessary to get a policy issue onto a government agenda, or to convince a larger group of people that your policy solution is actually the right one to follow. The second type of policy analyst is the politician type. They have all of the skills that the first group lacks. So they're very convincing. They have very good public speaking skills. They can use whatever evidence is presented to them and build narratives and stories and push forward their ideas. But they wouldn't be very rigorous in how they use research and data, and often they can be wrong in the policy ideas that they are pursuing. And the third type of policy analyst is what in literature is called a policy entrepreneur. So they are very good at finding and using the evidence and the data that they need to make their arguments, but they also possess the skills to build alliances, to build coalitions, to present publicly, distill the main message that they want to push forward, and spread this message to as many people as possible so they can convince beneficiaries, civil service, and other actors that they need to convince to follow their policy proposal. What we strive is to become policy entrepreneurs. In this way, we can really make sure that we have done our utmost to push our policy ideas forward and in an efficient and effective manner make our best efforts to influence policy. Let's look at the policy analysis tools. I have singled out a number of them. There's more, of course, but these are the ones that have been most useful in my work and that I found most useful in the different policy practitioners who have been engaging in policy work and talking to us about the way that they engage in this type of work. If we can think back at the policy cycle, the first step, the first stage is problem definition. Now there's a think tank based in London. It's called the Overseas Development Institute, and they do a lot of overseas work. And they've come up with a very simple tool to get to the core of the policy problem. It's called the 5 whys of problem definition. The idea behind this tool is that you ask why as many times as necessary in order to get to the core issue that should be addressed by the policy decision-making process that you're engaged in. I like to present this with an example because it's easier to understand. So let's say we have this country X, and close to 70% of its 15-year-olds are functionally illiterate, according to the PISA study of 2015. So just a little bit of explanation here for maybe some of you who might not be as familiar with the education sector as I am. So the OECD has created this test for 15-year-olds. It looks at how they apply knowledge in some core subjects, and they compare those data to all of the different test results from the countries that participate. In this way, they can really see what the state of the education sector is. So when you get a country that has participated and close to 70% of their young people are functionally illiterate, it's shocking, but it's not very clear what that specifically means. So we asked the first time, why does this matter? And the answer would be because functionally illiterate children can technically read and write, but are unable to use reading and writing skills for more complex study, work, or even life functions. Okay, so we ask again, why does this matter? Because the inability to use literacy skills for more complex functions as a child or a young person has the tendency to be reflected in adulthood as well. So if we are unable to use the knowledge that we learned in school to apply it to real situations, in this case reading, but they also test mathematics and science, chances are that as adults we will be falling behind as well. So why does it matter? Well, to succeed in a knowledge economy, workers must have good literacy skills. Why does it matter? In 10 years, this generation of youth will be unable to engage productively into the competitive job market if they don't have the necessary literacy skills. And then we ask for the 5th time, why does this matter? Well, because with 30,000 or 40,000 young unskilled workers joining the labor market every year, this particular country's social and economic development stands no chance. So we went from an education issue that has been presented in a very abstract or unclear way, using jargon, so saying functional illiteracy is not very clear to everyone what it could mean. We went from that to making the link to future economic development and job growth that is very important for any country. And we've gone through this process not only to find what the core issue is, but also to be able to get as many people on board to change this education sector that will keep our youth behind their peers in other countries and will keep our economy not growing at the pace that we would want it to grow. After we've defined the problem we are attempting to address, it's important to look at what the issue is specifically. And this really helps with the policy formulation phase, and who the stakeholders are. Let's look at the issue analysis first. We ask a set of questions that are going to give us the answers for why this particular issue is being addressed with our policy making efforts. So we ask why we do this, what's already happening in the country on this issue, what's happening in other countries, how does this fit with other things that are happening in the economy or the social policy in the country, what has been tried in the past, how successful have these efforts been in the past. And here you look at evaluation and monitoring reports, should there be any, or any NGO work that was done to research how this particular field was regulated before. We can ask, how will any of the changes that were made then impact on what is already being done? And what we know about the potential alternative outcomes. This analysis of the issue at stake is best done in a brainstorming session with people who would have the necessary evidence and data handy. So when the questions are asked, there can be quick answers being given in order to really do a quick scan of what the issue is and what are some of the policy alternatives that can be brought forward and formulated in order to then find the best one that can be pushed through to policy adoption stage. Stakeholder analysis looks at the actors that are involved in a certain policy or in a certain field. So it uses the same logic as issue analysis. It just looks at the people or organizations that are either beneficiaries or in a way decision makers or have a say in the policy that we're trying to influence. We try to figure out who has an interest and why. How will they be affected? What interests do they represent and how important are those interests? Can communication happen with these stakeholders? Are they going to be your allies or are they going to be opposing you? How can you influence these stakeholders? How can you get them to work with you? And how can you manage their expectations? Again, in a brainstorming sessions with people who have been perhaps engaging in this field before, if this exercise is happening within a government office, looking at people within the administration who have worked on this issue before, who are aware of the evaluation and monitoring that has happened before, who know which of the actors will be affected and who will potentially be an ally and who will potentially oppose you on this particular journey, it's very useful to do the initial scan. After the initial stakeholder analysis, it's very useful to place these stakeholders, these actors, onto a map. The map or the diagram will have two axes. One is the interest axis, so how interested in this topic are the stakeholders or the beneficiaries, the policy actors that are going to influence your policy process. And on the vertical axis, you have their influence and power. How influential are they? Can they change the course of your work? And as you can see, the boxes are, you group the different policy actors according to its box. So you have high influence and low interest actors on the upper left hand, down to low influence and high interest actors on the lower right hand box. With the high influence and low interest actors, you want them to either move to high influence, high interest group. So you want them to use their influence to help you to push your policy idea forward. And in order to do that, you might want to keep them informed and interested and engaged. But most of your efforts will be focused on the high influence and high interest people, those who both have the influence to change the course of your work and have very high interest in seeing this policy through or in opposing this policy. So you really focus on the red box. The blue box, the people who have high interest in the topic but have low influence, you have to watch out for those to see whether their rights are being observed, because it's usually groups that are marginalized, perhaps, that have a high interest because they are beneficiaries of this policy, but have very low influence. And so whatever decisions are made can affect their lives disproportionately more than other groups. And the orange box, it's low influence, low interest. If you have time and resources, perhaps you keep them informed, but it's also possible to just not engage in order to really be effective and efficient in your policy work. This is the next tool, backcasting, that not only helps with policy analysis, but also with policy implementation. Basically, what backcasting means is that you set a date in the future by when a certain policy needs to be implemented or show results, and then you work backwards from that to identify who needs to do what, by when, in order to reach the deadline that you yourself has put forward for the policy to work or to show results. So let's say we're building a children's hospital. By 2025, it needs to be functional. So what do we need to do today in 2022 in order to achieve the building of this hospital 3 years from now? Again, bringing together a team who is aware of all of the different regulatory and administrative bases surrounding this process. So who are the people that will be affected? Who does the land belong to where this hospital will be built? How do we do the procurement process to get the tendering out in order to get companies interested to build this hospital? How much will all of this cost? What do we need to take into account that could delay the process? And who should do what? So once this plan is put in place, the chances are that there will be any problems that arise will be addressed on time, and the policy failure potential is reduced. You're probably all familiar with the SWOT analysis. Basically looks at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of the certain policy issue you find yourself working in, or the team that is surrounding you as you do your work. So let's say that you are working for a non-governmental organization and there's an issue that you really are passionate about and trying to push forward. You look at your team and you see what the strengths of your team are. What weaknesses do you have in your team? So maybe you don't have enough researchers to get the proper data in place. So you need to address that particular issue. And then what are the opportunities that arise for you to raise this particular issue, and what could threaten your work? A SWOT analysis is very useful when it's done at the policy formulation stage. So you have different alternatives put forward to solve a certain policy problem, and looking at what their strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats are, is a good way to make sure that the best policy alternative is going to be adopted, and it increases the chances that during its implementation, it reduces policy failure potential. If you're new to the country or to a certain topic, so let's say you're working for a government that has come to power recently, and the minister is not experienced in the field that they are going to govern, it's important to engage in what's called a pestle analysis. So a pestle analysis asks a series of questions that look at the context in which a certain policy is taking place, or a certain policy solution is being implemented. P stands for political. It asks questions about the form of government, how stable is the government, how transparent, whether the government is, the decision-making power is split between national and local government, is there a strong civil society, etc. So it looks at the political context that could affect your policy proposal. E stands for economic. So what are some of the economic elements that could be affecting your work? What is the GDP? What are the taxation and revenue policies in place? Is the inflation rate stable? Is there high unemployment? What is the welfare policy? Is there a lot of debt, etc.? The S stands for social. It looks at demographics, income distribution, social mobility, and levels of education. This is important, especially if you're coming into a new country, to see what is the social composition that you would need to take into account as you push forward a certain policy. T stands for technological, asking a series of questions about the technology that is able to make your policy area better in one way or another, or that challenges your policy area. So is the energy supply reliable? How good are the roads? So what is the infrastructure situation? What is the infrastructure if you're working on a specific field like health? How do the hospitals look like, right? What is the accessibility to physical places, but also internet, etc. The L stands for legal. It looks at the rule of law in the country, whether the judiciary is independent or not. What is the legislation that really sets the legal basis for your policy that restricts it or enables it? And the last E is environmental. It looks at the state of environment, regional variations, the legislation, the environmental legislation, energy production and consumption, water and waste, or whatever environmental elements affect your policy area. So this exercise, again, should be done in a brainstorming session or scanning the main papers that have been published by organizations like, let's say, the World Bank or the UN, or if the statistical office is reliable, looking at the local statistical office, getting the main data and figuring out what is the context in which your work is taking place, to be able to assess the risks that could affect your work, but also the opportunities that could enable your work. But there's a trend worldwide towards evidence-based policy making, and by policy making, there I include also policy design and policy implementation. To engage in evidence-based policy design, it's important to scan existing research quickly, get the main data, look at the evaluation of programs that were similar to the one you're trying to implement, and seeing what their results are. What are the official data and statistics? And this is done very quickly and then presented in a small policy brief, so not a big report that will end up in a shelf and no one will read it. It will have only the main information included there, and will have one message and one call to action. So one key proposal or recommendation that is then used for the policy making process. You know, if we come to this point, what I'd like you to do is to just take 10 minutes and think as a sort of an exercise for the current policy issue you're working on. Where can you get your evidence that you can use for the policy proposal that you're building? You know, are there universities that have published something recently? Are there NGOs that have been working on this issue and there's research that can be used? How good is your statistical data? And think which tool you could potentially use in order to do the analysis necessary to push your work forward. And one last note before we close this session. Sometimes there can be too much evidence out there, especially if you engage in a pestle analysis where you look at the political and the social and technological and environmental elements that could affect your context in which your policy work is being done. And when there's too much information, that clouds your thinking, or when there is no evidence. Let's say the statistical office is not reliable, so you can't use their evidence, you can't use their data as evidence for your policy formulation, then the best thing you can do is go out and do field work. And this doesn't only apply to researchers, this applies to people working in government, civil service, who are engaging in a certain policy issue. And in order to really find out what the issue is about, it's important to go out there and observe. And this does much more than just define the problem or the issue that should be addressed, or even find the solution. It also moves you a step further to getting the buy-in that you need from the beneficiaries. So as you're asking them questions about how their perception of this issue is, or as you're looking at how this particular policy is being implemented on the ground, you're also sending a message that you're out there, you're working on this topic, and that you care.